I'm a bit old school. When I go into the shops, I always have a look at the front page of the papers, and if I see a front page that grabs my interest, I'll buy it. And one of the things, one of my bad habits, is I quite often keep it if it's a particularly interesting story or a story that catches my interest for whatever reason. I quite often keep them. Consequently, 20 years later, I've got stacks of newspapers all over the flat. Now, one of the things I'm going to do is grab a newspaper, look at the story that encouraged me to get it, and do a wee video on it. And so, yeah, it's going to take me years. So when I get home, I will start that process, and I will see what comes off the top of the first pile. Should be interesting.
Okay, the first newspaper article off the top of the pile is damning 20-year wait for council housing. Tories blast huge delays. So let's have a wee read of the piece. Scots are having to wait decades for social housing, shock figures show. Some would-be tenants languishing on waiting lists for more than 20 years. One applicant in East Lothian has been on the waiting list 47 years and 10 months, while in North Ayrshire, one household has been waiting a staggering 41 years. In 21 council areas, the average wait is more than a year, which is surprisingly short, in my opinion. But there you have it. Scottish Tory housing spokesman Miles Briggs said the SNP's failures to prioritise the social housing emergency was disgraceful. Vulnerable people are suffering the consequences. People should not have to be left languishing on temporary accommodation for a year, never mind more than 2 decades. These figures are a damning indictment of the SNP Green Coalition's housing failures. And it goes on to say all but 3 of Scotland's 32 councils responded to the Tory request for figures under the Freedom of Information Act. Okay, let's unpack that. First off, one of the things that kind of jumps out straight away is my understanding is the housing budget is set in Westminster. Now, obviously, the Scottish Government gets the Barnett consequentials derived from that, and the Scottish Government can adjust that budget up and down by, either taking money out of that budget and transferring it to other budgets that they see as a higher priority, or they can also pull money in from other budgets into the housing budget as they see fit. So that's something I'm going to have to look into. But, at the end of the day, it is Westminster that sets a housing budget, so they really set the agenda. And one thing, it's not just vulnerable people that are suffering the consequences. Working people are suffering the consequences as well. And I think this is something all the parties forget. To take an obvious example, if you have a worker in a particular part of the country and they see a job in Edinburgh or another area where there's, very high pressures in the housing market, and they can't afford the accommodation prices, they can't take that job. So the housing crisis has a direct impact on the economy. So, that's something politicians really need to think about. And it's something they all, in my view, completely miss. But one other thing, obviously Westminster controls immigration policy. For the year with the most recent statistics, something approaching 1 million people arrived in the UK. The Scottish Government's got no say in that at all. So if you've got 1 million people coming to the UK, and I know in England they built something like 160, maybe 200,000 homes in the equivalent year, but straight away you can tell them that the pressures are huge and they're getting worse. I mean, I saw one piece in a paper that projected the housing waiting list in the UK to reach 2 million within 10 years. And that is largely because of the discrepancy between immigration and construction. And so, I think this critique of the Miles Briggs critique of the SNP housing policy is really quite shameful. It's audacious. Given the budget is set in Westminster and there's limits to how much the SNP or the Scottish Government can adjust that, and given that Westminster controls immigration policy, of course the SNP would like to have open borders, but that's another story for another day perhaps. But no, I think it's quite audacious of the Miles Briggs to critique the SNP government on the housing crisis. There's enough blame to go round, and I can't imagine the Labour Party is going to make much difference either. But again, that's another story for another day. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the read. Thanks.